Resident Evil 5 has been at the center of significant debate since its release, especially when it comes to its portrayal of Africa and its people. It's been criticized as being outright racist since 2009, though many disagree with that view. I'm not about to rant about wokeness, nor will I insult or belittle the author of this article. If you enjoy inflammatory videos such as those, then this isn't the video for you. I also won't rant about how utterly racist the game is either. My goal is to take an objective look at the game and dive into the facts about the lore, the setting, the characters, the development, the marketing, and the sociological elements of Resident Evil 5. I want to represent the game as fairly as possible. For those who are unfamiliar with Resident Evil, I'll give a brief breakdown of what it is. Resident Evil is a horror game franchise owned by Capcom. The franchise has been around since 1996, leading up to its most recent release, the Resident Evil 4 Remake. Its main focus has always been killing zombies and containing viruses, even in 2009 with the release of Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 had some big shoes to fill after the success of Resident Evil 4, but it didn't quite live up to expectations. People's main problem was its heavy deviation from horror, a change that didn't feel right to many fans. It was my first shooting game and my first Resident Evil game. So at the time when I played it in 2012, my child self didn't see anything wrong with it. That wasn't until I was able to watch videos of and play other Resident Evil games. I do remember hearing about allegations of racism being sent RE5's way back then, but I figured that I didn't see an issue, so there must be no issue. Fast forward 12 years later, and here I am, still playing the game to this day. I've played and owned Resident Evil 5 multiple times, from 2012 to 2003. What? From 2012 to 2023. I still play it nowadays, just the most recent time I bought it was in August 2023. It was bundled with the original RE4 and Resident Evil 6. I don't know if I can finish RE6. I remember hating it as a kid, and I still hate it. So I have a long history with this game. This article here comes from The Gamer. It was written March 16th, 2023. That was about a year before that Resident Evil 5 article by IGN released. The way this is structured is I'm gonna read a paragraph from this article by The Gamer, and then I'm gonna freaking reply to it. And I've written all of this down, and not only will I be reading that, but I'll also be using that as a bit of a guideline to kind of structure this video, because I don't want it to be all over the place. And I'm going to skip over the first paragraph of this article. What it says is pretty uninteresting. The second article really gets into what we're going to be talking about. Resident Evil 5 is the next logical step, given it's a mostly iterative sequel with many of the same gameplay mechanics and set pieces. It also has mandatory co-op even if you're playing alone, removing what little horror was left by giving you characters with twice the firepower. Resident Evil 4 influenced Gears of War, and in turn Resident Evil 5 looked at Gears of War and decided it needed a slice of that gray, edgy, and bloated pie. It's not a bad game, but I'd struggle to describe it as anything more than a pale imitation. The game's legacy is also eternally tainted by its racism. Intentional or not, it's there. Capcom likely saw the success of games such as Metal Gear Solid 4, Gears of War 1 and 2, Team Fortress 2, Call of Duty 4, and Halo 3 and decided to go for a more action-packed game with Resident Evil 5. But the transition from horror to action displeased fans, as this change deviated from the franchise's long-standing connection to survival horror. In a 2008 interview from Eurogamer, a producer of Resident Evil 5, Jun Takeuchi, stated, "We settled on the fact that we really wanted to show the origins of the virus. So for the setting, we thought, how about the place where humankind was born? Africa is crucial to the game's story and setting." And I'm gonna tackle the racism claims later on. I was still in primary school when Resident Evil 5 was first unveiled, so my understanding of racism and the historical role it plays in global socio-political culture was fairly lacking. I just wanted to murder zombies with my friends. It didn't matter what color they were or what country I happened to be in, the infection must be cleared, and not putting my upgraded shotgun to use would be a tragic waste. But even back then, there was something uneasy about how the game depicted Africa and the awkward marketing eager to focus on a white man waltzing into an impoverished town only to murder its inhabitants. Yep. In Resident Evil 4, players enter an impoverished town and are attacked by infected villagers. Similarly, in Resident Evil 5, Chris and Sheva enter in an impoverished town and are attacked by infected villagers. They are not there to kill indiscriminately, but to apprehend Ricardo Irving, who is suspected of trafficking bioorganic weapons. They had a local contact who was kidnapped and executed at the behest of the instigator Magini, the man with the megaphone. The instigator Magini spotted Chris and Sheva watching the execution from the window of a market building. The Magini townspeople launched a violent attack upon them, leaving Chris and Sheva no choice but to defend themselves. I understand why, at first glance, the depiction of Africa can make you feel uneasy. Seeing Chris killing an abundance of Africans might cause discomfort, especially if you're aware of the struggles Black people have historically faced at the hands of white people. However, when provided context, these concerns should be alleviated. I will soon expand on the context I'm referring to, but now it's time to move to the next paragraph. The reveal trailer that dropped in 2005 has deliberately vague descriptions of where it takes place or what the game is even about. Chris Redfield is back, this time without his bulging muscles, and is seen walking the quiet streets of a shanty town until an unseen horde of infected rushes his position. A gun is drawn before a Biohazard 5 logo splashes onto the screen. At first glance, this trailer is pretty innocent and early on enough in the game's production that I'm unsure if certain locations and characters were even decided yet. The E3 2007 showing wasn't nearly as lucky with its preview of the game's opening, which, without the presence of your partner Sheva, boils down to a hench white dude beating the shit out of hostile African natives. This caused backlash at the time, with the hasty addition of a mixed-race co-op partner making it seem like Capcom was trying its best to save face and pave over its unfortunate positioning. That Resident Evil 5 trailer released in 2005, and understandably, the game's setting was possibly indeterminate, given its early stage in development. It's common for early marketing to focus more on atmosphere and tone, rather than detailed character introductions or plot. For instance, the Cyberpunk 2077 reveal trailer from 2013 was a cinematic, just like the 2005 Resident Evil 5 trailer. It was published years before Cyberpunk officially released, and the only context it provides is regarding cyberpsychos and max tag. Cyberpunk 2077 was in early development at this time, so any further context about the story and setting was vague as a result. Regarding the 2007 E3 trailer, Sheva already existed at this point. She had been in development for years. Sheva went through significant changes during development. Originally set to be part of a local militia group, she was turned into a BSAA agent. It wasn't Capcom's intention to portray Africans generally as savages, or prop up Chris as this white man who just is taking down the Africans or something, or whatever you're thinking about. Most viewers understood that Chris was fighting off waves of infected. You could argue that a game set in Africa is of course going to result in people of color being infected, which is a valid point. That view falls away the moment Chris and Sheva venture into the swamplands and are immediately assaulted by natives donning bamboo skirts, whose main mode of combat is throwing homemade spears while screaming in a dialect that feels ripped straight out of insensitive 30s cartoons. It's difficult to defend, and especially awkward to revisit all these years later. Any Resident Evil game set in any place will result in the local population being infected and subsequently killed by viruses and bioweapons. It doesn't matter what race, gender, or sexuality you are. These facts do not fall away when encountering the Indepaya people. It is a major part of the game's internal logic. They're African, they live in Africa, and live close to Kijuju. In Chapter 3.1, you find a diary from a village youth in the marshlands. It states, "A man who said he was the foreman of the oil plant came to visit us today. He said he wants to inoculate everyone living near the oil field against some kind of disease. Tricell's African branch stole their land, converted it into an oil field as a front for their experiments, and tricked the Indepaya people into thinking a disease was spreading. The vaccine they administered to them was actually Pelaga type 3 eggs." The diary chronicles the village's deterioration and descent into bloodthirstiness. Tricell's exploitation and destruction of the Indepaya tribe is critical to the game's narrative. Tricell is the enemy. When venturing into the marshlands, you are assaulted by them because they are infected. The Pelaga type 3 eggs made them violent, and aggressive. The Undapaya people wearing bamboo skirts is not a negative depiction. Tribal people wear clothing made of resources from their land. This is an accurate representation of indigenous and tribal people's practice to make clothing from resources like animal hide and materials from plants such as cotton. Them using spears as a weapon is to be expected. The spear is a great tool, weapon, and it has a lot of historical significance, even signifying high status in tribes. And they're not speaking in a dialect, they speak Swahili, a commonly spoken language. Depicting a real language spoken by millions is not inherently racist. I understand why these depictions may be perceived as problematic, given the historical negative stereotyping and degradation of tribal cultures. But that's not what's going on here. Media creators do need to be aware of these issues, though, and make an effort to be empathetic and respectful in their depictions. In 2009, Africa had some of the world's foremost universities, situated in bustling urban metropolises, and yet Capcom decided to portray its people not as modern workers, but as savages in stereotypical tribal gear. It's a trope as inaccurate as it is insensitive. Africa is a sprawling continent, and Resident Evil 5 views it as a singular entity with few worthwhile characteristics to underpin the people and cultures who call it home. It's a generic and offensive interpretation of the continent. Perhaps this dodgy misstep would fly in 2009, but to remake it and fail to acknowledge how problematic it remains borders on complete ignorance. Africa has diverse people and cultures. The Undapaya tribe wearing traditional attire is not negative or racist. Their violent and aggressive behavior is, as I said, because they were duped into accepting injections of the Plaga Type 3 virus, and were physiologically changed from then on. Capcom's depiction is not suggesting that all of Africa is impoverished or violent. Its focus is specifically on the game's setting in the story. You can't expect the Undapaya people to wear modern clothing or be depicted as modern workers. That would deviate from key points of the game's story. Even if all the African people in the game were put into urban metropolises, they would all still be infected and then violently attack anyone who isn't them. Due to Africa being a continent, it isn't inaccurate to base a story in a small, underdeveloped town. There are many locations like that in Africa, and those areas have been exploited by corporations, which is a core theme of Resident Evil 5. It is heartbreaking, it's definitely uncomfortable, but you should be heartbroken for the Undapaya tribe and the people of Kajuju who have been subjected to years of suffering at the hands of Tricell. You shouldn't be angry at Chris and Sheva for having to exterminate the viruses that has destroyed the Undapaya tribe and Kajuju. I'm not saying a potential remake of Resident Evil 5 needs to abandon Africa entirely, only that major revisions are required for it to stand the test of time. The fourth is campy and far removed from reality, in ways that allow it to lean into charming eccentricity, while Resi 5 is far more grounded, realistic, and oddly graphic in its visual execution. Everything feels a bit hopeless, even as you venture underground to pilfer ancient ruins for treasures. Stereotypes are reinforced with increased examples of vulgarity as the campaign tries to inject some manner of variety into its generic fights. It's bleak and requires a far more extensive reimagining or even a full rewrite if it hopes to avoid causing offense and abandon its prior baggage. It's not impossible though. And perhaps Resident Evil 4's success will be a sign for Capcom to broach upon a new timeline, so it doesn't remake every game in existence before having no idea where to go next. Take risks now and reap the ample rewards years down the line. After 5 comes 6, and trust me, nobody wants that. I know I don't. 1. Abandoning Africa would create major plot holes and overlooks the lore of Resident Evil. All the viruses that appear in Resident Evil originate from the progenitor virus. The progenitor virus's place of origin is in Kajuju, West Africa. The setting of Kajuju, West Africa isn't random. It's foundational to the lore of the entire franchise. Both games are science fiction. And the third sentence that talks about the ancient ruins is referring to Chapter 4, Part 1 and 2. The way the first part of this sentence is structured would make anyone none the wiser believe that your goal is to rob ancient Undapaya ruins. This is a misinterpretation. After defeating Irving in his boss battle in Chapter 3-3, he tells Chris,
"All your answers are wait ahead, Chris. In that cave. If you can survive long enough to get them."
Chris was wondering where Jill was. He was wondering what the Ouroboros virus was. He was not pilfering ancient ruins. The treasure is a gameplay feature, and the treasure in the game is there to provide you an extra means of obtaining in-game currency and act as collectibles. You take treasures that you find throughout the game as you do in Resident Evil 4, the remake of 4, and Resident Evil 8. Real quick, I'm going to refer to both RE4 games as one, by the way. So from here on, when I say RE4, I'm talking about both the OG and the remake, unless I separate them. In Resident Evil 4 and 8, you kill people in underdeveloped towns and steal their treasure. Resident Evil 4 and 8 are based in Spain and Romania, respectively. There's advanced places in those countries, such as Madrid and Barcelona in Spain, and Bucharest and Cluj-Napoca in Romania. In all three of these games, you enter underdeveloped, impoverished towns and kill its, depicted as savage, inhabitants and steal their treasure. Your main objection appears to be that in Resident Evil 5, you kill Black Africans in Africa, a predominantly Black continent. The whole continent. Even if they changed the game setting to an urban metropolis, you would still be killing Africans in the game. I've struggled whilst writing this part. At first, I was going to wholeheartedly defend the game against all accusations of stereotyping. It's more complex than an is or isn't. I don't think the intention was to stereotype or perpetuate stereotypes of Africa. The history of Kijuju and the lore details a war-torn country which descended into economic ruin due to unstable and ineffectual leadership. This would explain why the city is impoverished. But what about the violence post-war? Well, that unstable and ineffectual leadership had overthrown the original government and held extreme nationalist beliefs. Simplifying it, extreme nationalism is a strong belief in the superiority of your nation over others. This rhetoric was adopted by the people of Kijuju, leading to widespread racism and xenophobia, which resulted in Kijuju natives attacking foreigners. An Islamist group led by BIIANSU purchased Type 2 plagas, and they administered it to the locals to build a rebel army. By 2009, chaos had befallen Kijuju once again. It's understandable that Capcom, a Japanese game studio, might not have been fully aware of the social discourse surrounding Africa in the West. This makes the depiction of Kijuju, the people of Kijuju, and the Ndapaya people in Resident Evil 5 discomforting to some, as it inadvertently touches on sensitive issues. If you do a little bit of research, you'll see that Africa is consistently depicted as either savages or underdeveloped and impoverished in West and many different places around the world. And this is why people have a problem with the setting of Kijuju. But it wasn't created with the purpose of trying to stereotype the people or being like, look, all Africans are poor and savage. Like, that's just unfair and not true. Not talking about vulgarity, it is vulgar. The Ndapaya people are trying their damnedest to kill you, to defend their land, and because the Plaga Type 3 is influencing you to have a high amount of aggression. I completely understand why they're trying to defend the ruins, but Chris and Sheva aren't there to rob them or necessarily harm them. It's just treasure in a video game that is to be sold for an in-game currency. It's bleak because it's stories of people being forcibly infected with viruses that mutate them into aggressive monsters who can no longer control themselves. I surmise that when you speak of a reimagining of the story, or there needing to be a full rewrite, what you mean is either taking the game out of Africa, which we know would create major plot holes, in the entire story of the franchise because the events of every Resident Evil game has happened because of the origin virus, the progenitor virus, which first appeared in Africa, or taking every Black Majini out of the game, which would be Black erasure, which is racist. Like, imagine that. Taking every single Black person out of a game based in a continent that they are native to and that they predominantly exist in. Resident Evil is in dire need of its Final Fantasy VII Remake moment, a bold new entry that establishes how dedicated it is to honoring the past, while moving towards a bright future. Village could have achieved this, but instead leaned on the iconic status of 4, despite its own remake waiting patiently in the wings. It isn't serious enough in its personality or lore to take on a setting like Africa and effectively interrogate the elements of race likely to dominate the minds of most players. Either abandon it or redefine it. Otherwise, a remake is doomed to repeat the same fatal mistakes. History will come knocking the second gamers are asked to confront Resident Evil's polarizing reputation and how it marked a turning point in the franchise that almost spelt its end. Forge an innovative new path into the future without relying on a troubled past. I think what you're trying to say is that Resident Evil 5 isn't serious enough to use Africa as a setting and explore the issues of race that will affect most players. Resident Evil 5 is not based on race. Fully at least, if you want to disagree with that. The lore explores themes of eugenics, corporate corruption, and bioterrorism. Some of the main villains of the franchise are white eugenics scientists. They're the reason why these viruses, derived from the progenitor virus, exist. The main antagonists of Resident Evil 5 are not Africans. They are a wealthy pharmaceutical company, and characters such as Albert Wesker, Excella Guioni, and Ricardo Irving. 3 white people. The Resident Evil franchise has always depicted concepts like, quote-unquote, perfecting the human race through eugenics as reprehensible. If you don't believe Resident Evil has roots in being inspired by eugenics, then here's your proof. I've seen people try to say that it's not when it literally is. Oswald E. Spencer is literally a eugenicist, or was. He literally started Umbrella to fund his vision. These people who started this Project Wesker with him were all eugenicists. I mean, it's so on the nose. They were literally gonna make the Ashford twins be from Germany, but for obvious reasons, they backed out of that. So, yeah. I just had to cut in real quick because, you know, the way I explained it originally was, I don't know, not the cleanest. Basically, I'm saying I didn't do that good of a job. Alright, back to the video. Wesker embodies the dangers of eugenics. He was created from the pursuit of developing perfection in the human race. He became obsessed with this idea, leading to the decay of his morals and the growth of his ego. His story highlights the dangers of manipulating human genes to create quote-unquote superior beings and the lack of empathy that usually accompanies eugenics. Resident Evil criticizes the way that eugenics seeks to create a master race and highlights its unethical and dangerous nature. Throughout the franchise, you're consistently opposing and destroying the machinations and creations of eugenics.
When dark days came to us, we found no haven or escape. All our prayers go unanswered today. This fear within, our screams share.